All right, hello and welcome to this lecture on Hinduism. So I'm going to be talking to you from my back porch in 111-degree heat. If you see me sweating here, it's not because I'm worrying that myself as a distinct self doesn't exist, as we're going to talk about in the Hindu conception. I'm sweating because it is 111 degrees, and I'm the kind of weirdo that kind of likes being out in it. So we're going to talk about Hinduism. And look, there's one of the oldest religions in the world. There's so many strands. It has many aspects of this religious tradition, and far more than we can talk about. And especially as a philosopher and in a course on world religions and philosophy, we're going to focus in on what I'm going to call the meaning of life in Hinduism. And I guess to be more accurate, we could call it the meaning of life and the nature of the self, because those are the two philosophical issues we're really going to focus in on. Although we'll talk about many other aspects of the religion and lots of the background. So first, let's talk about a little bit of the history of Hinduism. I'm going to pull up a picture of the Indus Valley, and I'm going to share my screen in just a second. Here we go. This is a representation of the Indus Valley. So it's called the Indus Valley. The Indus River runs through here, from up in here, down through here, down here. This is in western or northwestern India today. This is the civilization. This is where the civilization that developed Hinduism, or where Hinduism developed, was. Around 1500 BC, a new group of people came into this Indus Valley called the Aryans. There is some connection with Hitler's use of that word, but it's very distant. And these were not the people that he was talking about. And when Hitler talked about blonde-haired and blue-eyed people, these were not those people. So it's unclear what the connection is there. It's probably very complicated historically. These were called the Aryan people. They spoke Sanskrit, was their language. There was a people in this valley before them. We don't know as much as we would like to about those people. We don't understand their language. I think we have some examples of it, but we can't interpret it. And because we can't interpret it, we can't learn a lot about the religion that they practiced and what they were like in many ways. But when the Aryans came in to the Indus Valley this is very rough approximation, around 1500 BC, it's been called the Aryan invasion, but some scholars think it really wasn't an invasion. It was a slow migration. So it's kind of a misnomer in that way. They came in, and then it was after that point where we have we have all of the texts of Hinduism, or that went into forming Hinduism. There was almost surely some influence from the prior civilization, but again, not knowing much about that civilization, we can't say exactly what those influences were. So this is the Indus Valley. This is where the sort of birthplace of Hinduism. Okay, so we're still screen sharing, but I'm going to pop over to, I don't know why it started in the middle of the presentation here. The PowerPoint here, the meaning of life in Hinduism. We're going to focus on this question of what the ultimate human goal is. And I'd argue that every major religion has some sort of view about what the ultimate human goal is, or the meaning of life. I'm going to treat those two questions as the same. And we'll talk about that. We're really going to focus on it most when we hit Hinduism. We'll also talk about it with the Judeo-Christian tradition as well. But we're probably going to focus on some other philosophical issues that crowd out that question, or give it less time at least, when we get to the Judeo-Christian tradition. All right. So with that said, let's talk about what the ultimate human goal is in Hinduism. Actually, let's pause for a second and talk about what we mean by that question, the ultimate human goal. Human goal is pretty straightforward. It's what humans should be doing, what the meaning of life is for human beings. And the ultimate goal just means this is, what everything else is oriented towards, right? So ultimate, that means there's some structure to our goals, right? Sometimes we do something for the sake of something else, right? I am teaching, I'm recording this lecture for the sake of having the course complete. And I'm having the course complete for the sake of your education, and you're getting educated for the sake of something else, etc. I eat food to be healthy. I'm healthy so that I can be happy. But then you might go and ask, but are you happy for the sake of something else? And you might argue that happiness is maybe good on its own. It's not, it doesn't have to be good for the sake of something else. And so in that sense, you could call it an ultimate goal, or an intrinsic good is another philosophical piece of jargon here. Okay. So to talk about the ultimate human goal is to talk about that human goal that orients all of our other goals. It's the thing that we're ultimately, I just used the term in its own definition, the thing that human life is really all about. And we might have other things we're pursuing, but they're for the sake of that thing. Now, side note, there are certain philosophical views on which there are multiple intrinsic goods or multiple ultimate goals, right? You could call these pluralistic views. So maybe happiness is good in itself, but maybe also freedom is good in itself. And maybe you can't reduce one to the other. All right. Side note ended. Stop. Close that bracket. Now let's talk about Hinduism, now that we've understood the question. Hinduism has had some influence on Western culture. But at the bottom, we have the Beatles here. They got really into these sort of Indian religious traditions, not necessarily mainstream Hinduism. We have yoga, which has come to us from this tradition. And up in the the top right-hand corner, we have Michael Scott really cringily dancing at a Diwali party, which is a Hindu religious holiday. Let's talk about this term, because this term, moksha, is really the key to understanding what the Hindu view of the good life is, or the ultimate human goal. Okay, so moksha translates to freedom or liberation. Now, let's talk about freedom as a word or as a concept. We talk about freedom a lot, politically especially. And we talk about it almost as if it kind of just makes sense by itself without talking about any further aspect or what it applies to. But I guess I'd argue that generally, when we talk about freedom, we're at least implicitly talking about freedom from something. Okay, so let's take some mundane examples. Freedom from addiction. You may have heard people talk about that, right? When they come out of an addiction, they might describe it as being free from that addiction. Here's a really literal case: being free from enslavement, right? You're free. You're not just free floating. You're free from this form of oppression. Okay, you could be free from a person, right? You have a breakup with someone who is toxic for you or something, and you're free from that relationship. Okay, no, I say implicitly, I think in the political context, this is still true. We talk about freedom, but what we really mean, I think, is freedom from unjust political intrusion or coercion. We're free. When Americans talk about freedom, we mean we're free from the government coercing us in ways that are illegitimate. And on the classical liberal model, those ways are illegitimate that so you're coerced illegitimately on at least classical liberalism if you're coerced or punished for something that didn't involve you hurting anybody else. Okay, so that's all just to say, when we talk about freedom, we mean freedom from something. And so we might naturally ask the question, I think this is a helpful question to ask. On the Hindu conception of moksha, what are we free from? Okay, so hold that question in your mind. Okay, what are we free from when we achieve moksha? All right, so bracket that for a second. We're going to come back to it in just a minute. Moksha is the ultimate human goal. on Hinduism? Freedom. Okay, so we could compare that to some other worldviews, whether secular philosophy or other religious traditions. So think about Aristotelian ethics. We haven't talked about this, but on Aristotle, the old ancient Greek view in general of the good life, it's happiness that's good. It's happiness that's the ultimate goal, or what they called eudaimonia. Now, they understood happiness a little bit differently, actually significantly differently than we do. But you can imagine a view, let's just say a simplistic view, on which happiness is the ultimate human goal. That's one view. And now we're going to give you this view, which is no, it's not happiness per se. It's freedom. And again, now our next question is freedom from what? And the answer is that on the Hindu conception, we're aiming to be free from the self in a particular sense. Hold on just a second. And its accompanying desires and impulse. Now, what do we mean by when we say the self? Well, the self, in the way that we would conceive of it, as the individual self distinct from other selves, right? So me as Dr. Morton, you as whoever you are, your individual self. And I say that because it might be possible to conceive of the self as maybe not separate from other people. And that's just sort of foreshadowing, because that might be possible on Hinduism. But thinking of yourself as distinct in the way that we typically think of ourselves. I'm different from my sister, my brother, and my wife, and all that. Okay, but let's think about all of the desires and impulses and feelings that are associated with thinking of ourselves as distinct from other people in this sense that we're familiar with. So think about like anger, but think about like a particular kind of anger. Think about the anger you feel when you have been, for example, disrespected. I think this is mostly what drives road rage. No pun intended. Which is the feeling that you have been belittled or disrespected or something by someone. It's not always the case that someone put the other person in danger that triggers their road rage, right? It's that they feel slighted or disrespected or something. Okay, so resentment is another emotion that we could talk about. You might resent it. If you were like a little sibling, you might be familiar with the feeling of resenting when one of your siblings gets praised over you. Think about our normal ambitions, right? We want to be promoted. We want to get prestigious jobs, maybe. Why? Why do we want that? Think about even the basic drive to avoid pain and pursue pleasant things for yourself. Okay, all of these things, I'd argue, it's a little bit of a stretch for a lot of us, but all of these things are really closely tied to our sense of ourselves as very much distinct from other people, not to mention the rest of the world, the non-people world. So you get angry when you've been disrespected because you think of yourself as a distinct person than this other person and then all these other people. You have this core assumption about yourself needing to be respected. So this is a very similar thing going on with resentment, right? Someone else, that is someone distinct from you, gets praised over you. And then you end up with this feeling that you, as distinct from them, need to be praised equally with them. Desire for prestige or ambition in general. Again, you're just trying to put yourself above other selves, okay? And even the desire to avoid pain and pursue pleasure, you're doing it for yourself. You're not trying to pursue pleasure for overall, right? Like that's pretty hard to do, right? If you were doing that, you would probably not care about your own pleasant experiences. You'd be trying to make pleasant experiences for everybody. Okay, so that distinction right there is really important. Let's focus in on pursuing happiness for just a second. There's two ways you could do it, right? You could pursue your own happiness, or you could try to make as much happiness as possible and just put yourself on the same level as everybody else. The second way of doing it is very much counter to how we generally operate, right? A good person will at least kind of sometimes think of the happiness of other people, but they will very rarely put that happiness over their own, always, even when it comes at a high cost to them. Okay, so what's behind all of this? Well, it's that this is all indicative, or really, I guess, assumes at a pretty bedrock level, to the extent that it doesn't even pop into our mind explicitly, that we are distinct selves from other people. We're distinct people. Of course, you wouldn't pursue your own good at the expense of others if you didn't assume that you were a distinct individual. Of course not. I mean, well, duh. I mean, of course, my ambition, my desire for this prestigious job is based at some very basic level on the sense that I am distinct from other people and I am uniquely important to me. Okay, so it might feel a little weird to talk about this just because it's such a basic assumption of so much of our action, right? Even our just basic everyday routines, caring for ourselves, assume the existence of that self. Okay, so that's just to say these are all, you have these because they are the promotion of your individual self. Now, I focused on these examples because these are kind of negative attitudes or emotions in a lot of cases. Maybe not trying to avoid pain, but we have some negative connotations with all of these. It doesn't feel good to be disrespected and to get angry about that. It doesn't feel good to be resentful. It's not very pleasant. It can actually kind of ruin your day or your week even. I don't know if y'all are dwell on things like I do, but when something happens to you like that and it gets down deep inside you, and then you're just thinking about it for days and days. And you could think of part of the vision of Hinduism as being that, well, offering us a way to get away from all of that. So let's not jump forward to this slide just yet. If you say, just go out on a limb with me for a second. If you could become convinced that you really, I don't want to say this in such a wild way. Let's work up to it. If you could become convinced that you really weren't more important than other people, you could practice putting yourself in the shoes of other people to the extent that their feelings and their emotions mattered just as much, at least, as yours. You could get away from a lot of this. Okay. So you wouldn't feel resent as much. You could maybe work on feeling happy for this person that was praised and not focusing so much on the fact that you weren't praised. You don't get the job that you want, or you don't get this prestigious position. Again, if you had more of a conception of other people mattering just as much as you might be able to be happy for that person that got that job or got that position and focus less on how much you wanted it. Okay, now let's take it a step further. Imagine, this is where we get into some deep sort of metaphysical, I guess, thinking about this. Imagine that you somehow became convinced of the philosophical position that individual selves really did not exist, that you as an individual person really did not exist, that you were somehow one with all of reality, or that reality was somehow undivided, right? Think of it like a pie, right? When you pull the pie out, it is an uncut pie, and then we mark the cuts into it with, I don't know, whatever you use to cut a pie, a knife, I guess. That's going to be my stupider moment of the lecture. So you cut the pie, you cut it into slices, right? Well, in a sense, like, there was no slice of pie to start with. You kind of marked these divisions in there. And in a sense, like, on the Hindu view, that is kind of what we've done. We've marked these arbitrary boundaries around ourselves, so much so that we've become convinced of this illusion that this thing right here, that, if you put me on the cement and drew a chalk outline, that outline is like this distinct thing. But really all I've done is I've basically cut the pie piece out, right? The pie is the real thing, and then we mark these arbitrary distinctions in it to make pieces of pie. Okay, so hold on to that metaphor if it helps you, and if it doesn't, then if I just made it worse, then like let it go or something. Okay, so what you'll see when you go to read the Upanishads, which is one of the things y'all are going to do, is you'll hopefully see this. You'll see this connection that the Hindu view is that really those selves do not exist, that reality is one and undivided in some sense. And so as you become enlightened, or as you come to know more and more about the world through various means, you will see more and more that you are not distinct from the rest of reality, and that your individual self does not exist in some sense. It's kind of hard to talk about because the pie, that area of pie certainly exists. But you could argue what the piece of pie was this arbitrary creation that we cut into the pie. Okay. All right. Let's talk about this. So if we want to achieve moksha, which is freedom from this sense of the self and all of its desires and impulses and things like that, so there are some ethical consequences of this. But then we can also talk about it springing from the ontological commitments of Hinduism. Let's talk about what ontological means. It means what exists, right? When you talk about whether God exists, you're doing ontology. You're talking about what there is in the world. When you talk about whether, I don't know, I guess even when you do some scientific tasks, like when you talk about what classes or kingdoms of animals there are, you're doing some ontology because you're talking about what kinds of things there are. In philosophy, when we go to argue about whether souls exist, for example, we're arguing about ontology, whether there is this such a thing as this immaterial part of the self, which we call the soul. Okay, so ontology, also, I treat that as synonymous with metaphysics. We're talking about what exists in the world. And the Hindu view is that there is one true divine reality, which is one and undivided. That's Brahman. Okay, that's their name for it. And that true reality is undivided. It's the whole pie, uncut. So there is no distinction or division within reality. Another term for this in philosophy is called monism. There is only one undivided reality. And so to talk about multiple things in the world is in some sense false. That's a mistake to talk about there being different people in the world. It's kind of like it might be a useful way of talking, and we might keep that way of talking, but it's misleading. There are not multiple things at bottom in reality. Okay, so think about other sorts of ways we have of talking that are not truly reflective of reality. And this might help you understand how the Hindu thinks of our sense of individual self as being illusory or false. I'll give you two examples. One is an actual literal illusion. That is, when you see it's really hot outside, you're driving on the road, you see it looks like there's water on the road. Okay, there's not. It's just the heat. I don't know. Not a scientist. Don't know why it's happening, but it's an illusion. The water's not really there. It might be useful to be able to talk about the water or the waves on the road. And we could talk like that, even though we really know that there's no water on the road. Okay, so that's one example. It's a useful way of talking, maybe, instead of having to talk about all the science. Look at the water on the road instead of spending 10 minutes referring to the physics of what's happening out there. Here's another way we might talk about like institutions or departments, even or groups of people, as if they have agency or will, even though we know it's not. It's just a big group of people that doesn't have some single unified will. So you might talk about, I guess, think about a philosophy department. That's what springs to my head. Or let's think about a university. You might hear people talking about, well, Texas Tech wants to do this. Okay, Texas Tech wants to grow their football program. Texas Tech wants their football program to go have a 9-win season this season. Okay, now, is it really true that the university, Texas Tech, has this desire? That'd be weird because it's people, it's humans that have desires, and Texas Tech is an institution. It doesn't have desires. But it's a useful way of talking, because the other option is to have this really cumbersome way of talking, which is to say, like, well, there are some individuals within the institution and their predominant feeling is that they would like to go 9-3 in the regular season. But there are those people who disagree with that, but they're a minority, blah, 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 blah. Right. So it's easier. It's way easier to just talk in terms of what the university wants, even though ultimately, if we reflect on it, we think that's not really true. Okay, so this is actually really helpful to think about, because if we are not careful, we could actually start to come to think of the university as actually having desires, just because of the way we talk and the way it's convenient to divide things up in the world. And so you might even, if you were really concerned with having a true knowledge of reality, or if in somehow we talking about the desires of the university was kind of destructive for us, we might need to kind of like work on eliminating this illusion that the university has desires. Now, in fact, there's nothing really wrong with that. It's not destructive in any way. It's only helpful to be able to talk about the university wanting something. But in the case of the Hindu view of the self, it is like that. We have this illusion, and maybe it's helpful sometimes to talk about individual selves, but ultimately it's not true. Reality is undivided. And in fact, the way we talk could be destructive in a way if we let it convince us that we exist, because it can get us to have all of those bad emotions and desires and really unhelpful and uncomfortable and, in fact, sometimes painful ways of thinking and feeling. And so it's getting freedom from that we have to work towards. And that's why you see, when you read the Upanishads, you see this connection between knowledge and freedom, between meditation and knowledge. You have to go out and really try to reconvince yourself of the true nature of reality as being undivided, in order to get free from this illusory sense of self. Okay, so I started at the bottom. I started with number 2 here. Atman is the name of the soul or the self in Hinduism. So let's just get our terms straight real quick before we move up to number 1. Atman is your soul, yourself, right? And it is real, but the true nature of reality, if you wanted to reduce it down to a slogan form, you would do this. You'd say it this way: Atman is Brahman. And when we think of Atman as being just some little part of Brahman, and there's other Atmans, that's when we're being deceived. That's the illusion. So in denying the separation, that is, that things can be, that Atman can be separate from Brahman, you're denying true reality, right? So Brahman is all reality, undivided. And when you realize, enlightenment in some sense is coming to the realization that Atman is Brahman. Okay, we've talked a little bit already. The reason I skipped 1 is because we've talked a little bit about this already. The ethical consequences, or you could call it just the practical consequences of attaining moksha. I alluded to this earlier. If you, on the Hindu vision, if you can meditate or whatever it takes, the various forms of yogas, which we'll talk about in other lectures, if you can get to the point of realizing that Atman is Brahman, that the individual self as distinct from other selves doesn't really exist, it only exists insofar as it's identical with everything, then you will have conceivably some very practical consequences. Why wouldn't you, right? If you became convinced that you didn't exist as a separate self, at least, why would you put your good over other people's good? Because they're just as real as you are, and you're really both identical with everything, and undivided reality, Brahman. And so their happiness matters just as much as your happiness. And all of these negative feelings like resentment, again, don't make sense anymore. That is associated only with this sense of, being offended, and being offended means that you, as this little self distinct from other selves, didn't get what you deserved. And same with disrespect and ambition and all of these things. Okay, so those are the practical or ethical consequences of enlightenment, of realizing that Atman is Brahman. Okay, this is where we'll stop for now. Having talked about just to wrap up and review, The concept of moksha being freedom, freedom from what? Well, freedom from this sense of a separate self. It's not the freedom from a sense of self, because really atman is that self. But the truth is that that self is identical with everything, right? So it's really freedom from a sense of separate self, of an individual, distinct self. Okay. And that ultimately goes back to the metaphysics of Hinduism, the ontology of Hinduism, that reality is undivided. Again, this is called monism in philosophy, in philosophical terms. And then finally, we talked about how there are certain ethical or practical consequences of that enlightenment, that you will become really a kinder, more benevolent, and you could even argue much more at peace person. All right. I'll see y'all next time.